In the Soviet Union, there was no name more sacred and none more feared than Stalin. But for one woman, that name was a life sentence. She was the daughter of the world's most powerful man, the little princess of the Kremlin. Yet, in 1967, Svetlana Alliluyeva would ignite a Cold War firestorm by walking into a foreign embassy and doing the unimaginable. She defected to the West, denouncing her father as a moral monster. Her story is not one of political ideology, but of personal survival. Every moment of her 85 years, every marriage, every move, every name change, was a desperate attempt to outrun the shadow of her birthright. She wanted a normal life. History condemned her to be a political trophy. As the historian Rosemary Sullivan wrote in her biography, Svetlana's fate was sealed from birth. She was doomed to be a political prisoner of her father's name. You can't live your own life. You can't live any life. You exist only in reference to a name. For a young Svetlana, the early years were filled with the deceptive warmth of a powerful father who called her his little sparrow. She was his favorite, the exception to his political cruelty. But her world was already defined by a time bomb. Her mother, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, was a fiery, intellectual woman who suffered under the increasing strain of her husband's monstrous rule. The tension shattered in November 1932, following a public, furious dinner party in the Kremlin. That night, Nadezhda committed suicide. Svetlana was just 6 years old. The immediate response from the Kremlin was the first great lie of her life. She was told her mother died of appendicitis. The truth, that her mother chose death over the reality of being Stalin's wife, was a secret too explosive to reveal to the dictator's daughter. This lie became the foundation of Svetlana's emotional life. A childhood lived under the illusion of a kind, strong father, concealing the brutal truth of the monster he was. This fragile illusion was destined to shatter. The fragile illusion of her childhood was brutally destroyed when Svetlana, at age 16, committed the ultimate act of defiance. She fell in love. The man was Alexei Kapler, a Jewish Soviet filmmaker and journalist, almost 2 decades her senior. Kapler introduced the sheltered Kremlin princess to a world of forbidden books, Hemingway, Russian poetry, and took her out to the cinema and galleries, away from the watchful eyes of the state. This was an act of profound political danger. Stalin was becoming increasingly anti-Semitic, and he viewed this relationship as a direct challenge to his absolute authority over his favorite child. When Stalin discovered the affair, he flew into a legendary rage. He slapped his daughter twice across the face, the physical assault shocking the entire household. But his vengeance was strictly political. He had Kapler immediately arrested. The crime was listed as treason and anti-Soviet agitation, but the real charge was insulting the dictator's family. Kapler was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag, exiled to the notorious Vorkuta labor camps. For Svetlana, this was a devastating awakening. She finally understood the scope of her father's cruelty. His political power was personal, merciless, and could destroy the life of anyone she loved. As she later confessed, this was one of the 2 times in her life that Stalin truly broke her. The historian Rosemary Sullivan, chronicling Svetlana's later confessions, explains the permanent damage. When Stalin purged Kapler, Svetlana understood she wasn't a daughter. She was a political asset. She learned that in her father's world, love was treated as a counter-revolutionary plot. This destroyed the last shred of normal filial affection and became the foundation for her later rejection of the entire Soviet system. For Svetlana, life in the Kremlin after the Kapler tragedy became an endless, stifling routine of compliance and silence. She married, divorced, and studied history as her father had commanded. She was waiting for her life to begin. Then came the stroke. The chilling 4-day silence at the Kuntsevo Dasha, followed by the news that the Iron Man of the Soviet Union was dead. For the rest of the country, it was a moment of national trauma. For Svetlana, it was the moment the Kremlin's shadow lifted. Her status, her protection, and her control were instantly gone. But the true earthquake came later. With Stalin gone, the official files and the hidden stories began to emerge. Svetlana finally learned the truth she had been shielded from for over 20 years. Her mother, Nadezhda, had not died of appendicitis. She had taken her own life. The discovery was a shock that redefined her entire past. The loving father who called her Little Sparrow was the same man whose cruelty drove her mother to suicide and whose paranoia sent her love to the Gulag. With the truth exposed, the name she carried, Svetlana Stalina, became unbearable. It was a name that evoked not family, but fear and loathing across a shattered nation. In an act of profound personal rejection, she officially changed her surname to her mother's maiden name, Alliluyeva. It was her first step toward claiming an identity separate from her father's monstrous legacy. But the state she lived in still viewed her as an asset, a living relic of the dynasty. Though she worked as a lecturer and translator, her life remained constricted by the Communist Party's influence. Her marriages, including a brief one to Yuri Zhdanov, continued to be intertwined with the highest levels of Soviet power. She was a ghost in the machine, the daughter of the man who ran the country, yet utterly lacking the freedom to live her own life. Decades after Kapler, Svetlana found love again, late in life, and in the most unexpected setting, a Moscow hospital. The man was Kunwar Brajesh Singh, an aging Indian communist writer. He was gentle, spiritual, and utterly unimpressed by her father's history. For Svetlana, Singh was the peace she had never known. She referred to him as her husband, and they shared a quiet life far from the Kremlin's suffocating politics. But when they tried to formalize their life, the Soviet system intervened one last cruel time. Despite Singh being a loyal communist, Soviet authorities flatly refused to allow them to marry or to allow Svetlana to leave the country permanently to be with him. The daughter of Stalin was still considered state property. When Singh tragically died in 1966, Svetlana requested one final, desperate favor: permission to travel to India to immerse his ashes in the sacred Ganges River. The Soviets, eager to be rid of the troubled asset for a short time, reluctantly agreed. This was her window. It was the only opportunity she would ever have to physically step outside the prison walls of the USSR. In India, Svetlana Alliluyeva scattered the ashes of the man she loved into the Ganges. Her duty was done. The Soviet embassy expected her to board a plane back to Moscow in 2 days, but Svetlana had reached her breaking point. On the evening of March 6, 1967, leaving her children and most of her belongings behind, she slipped out of the Soviet compound, walked to the nearest road, and hailed a taxi. Her destination, the United States Embassy. She walked past the Marine Guard, presented her passport, and told the stunned diplomats that she was Stalin's daughter and was seeking asylum. The request immediately triggered a diplomatic crisis of the highest order. The U.S. Embassy staff, barely believing her identity and terrified of a Soviet kidnapping accusation, acted fast. They issued her a tourist visa and placed her on the next available flight to Rome, before Moscow could even realize its most valuable asset had walked away. Svetlana had successfully completed the most sensational defection of the Cold War. But she quickly learned that escaping the Soviet Union was easier than escaping the name. After a secret stop in Switzerland, Svetlana arrived in New York City. The Cold War had just scored its most astonishing propaganda coup. At a crowded press conference, the daughter of the Soviet dictator publicly and unequivocally denounced the entire regime. She declared that she had come to America seeking the self-expression that has been denied me for so long in Russia. But her true target was her own blood. Svetlana spoke with devastating clarity about her father, branding Joseph Stalin a moral and spiritual monster. She condemned the Soviet system as a failure built on cruelty and human suffering. For the United States, this was a political earthquake. The daughter of the Soviet Union's key architect had testified against her own family, proving, in the eyes of the West, the complete moral bankruptcy of communism. The Soviet premier, Alexei Kosygin, could only respond by publicly dismissing her as a morally unstable person. But for Svetlana, the act was a declaration of independence. She had burned her Soviet passport and finally felt able to fly out free like a bird. However, freedom came with a price she was not prepared to pay. Svetlana's story was not just a political sensation. It was a commercial goldmine. Her memoir, 20 Letters to a Friend, written before she left the USSR, was rushed to publication. It became an instant international bestseller, detailing the surreal experience of growing up inside the Kremlin and providing a shockingly intimate portrait of her father. The book earned her an estimated $2.5 million. She was now rich, famous, and globally celebrated. Yet, her deepest desire, to be seen as a writer, a person, an individual, was utterly denied. She realized her fame was solely tied to the brutality of the man whose name she had tried so desperately to shed. Svetlana had gained freedom of movement, vast wealth, and global fame. Yet, she soon realized that the American dream was merely a different kind of prison. The world saw her not as a writer or a person, but as a Cold War curiosity, a political trophy whose value was solely tied to her infamous father. The attention was suffocating. She felt she had exchanged the confinement of the Kremlin for the confines of celebrity. In a desperate bid to shed her identity entirely, she married the American architect William Wesley Peters and changed her name again to Lana Peters. But the chaos followed her. Her marriages were brief, her fortune was squandered on impulsive projects, and her restless existence saw her bounce between America and Europe. The journalist and writer Malcolm Muggeridge, who knew Svetlana well in the West, captured the essential tragedy of her existence. She felt she had moved from one cage to another. In Russia, she was a prisoner of the party. In the West, she was a prisoner of the marketplace. The true prison was the name, and the world would never let her escape it. In 1984, in a final, impulsive attempt to find peace and reconcile with the two children she had left behind, Svetlana did the unthinkable. She moved back to the Soviet Union. The Soviets were delighted, restoring her citizenship and using her return as a propaganda win. But the reality was brutal. Her adult children in Moscow were suspicious, and she was quickly disillusioned, realizing the Soviet system was still intrusive, still bureaucratic, and still fundamentally oppressive. In another shocking dramatic exit in 1986, Svetlana renounced her Soviet citizenship once more and left. The brief return proved only one thing: she had no home. She had alienated the Soviet Union and failed to assimilate into the West. She was a woman without a country, doomed to wander. Svetlana Alliluyeva, the daughter of Joseph Stalin, died in seclusion in rural Wisconsin in 2011, poor and largely forgotten. Her life was the ultimate political tragedy of the Cold War. She could escape the Kremlin, but she could not escape the shadow of its architect. She was the one true revolutionary who sought not to seize power, but simply to be a person. But history's grip was too strong. Her destiny was sealed the moment she was born with the name Stalina. She proved that the totalitarian state is not only defined by the lives it takes, but by the lives it permanently fractures. Her fate remains a profound warning. A legacy of absolute power is never limited to the political sphere. Sometimes, the deadliest legacy is the one you carry in your own name.